Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, Riley, I want to thank you for being here today, and I want to recognize that you are a hero and a champion to women and little girls all over the country. And your bravery and courage is admired not only by little girls and women, but by Americans all over. And this goes across the political divide. I think you probably had no idea all the years you spent training in the pool, working out, you had no idea, earning your college scholarship, competing in the sport, women's sport, by the way, that you trained to compete in. You had no idea that you'd be sitting in a committee before Congress about left-wing organized violence. But here you are today. And I think that all started with having to compete with a man who's 6'1", named William Thomas, a biological male that invaded your sport, invaded your privacy, and came in to defeat, demoralize, and completely destroy the sport that you love. And so, number one, I want to recognize that, and I want to thank you. I'd also like to ask you a question here. You said, and this is in your testimony, you said that you were threatened, intimidated, assaulted, and held hostage. And I'd like to just give you a minute to go ahead and expand on that when you weren't able to finish. And please expand on that.
Right. I know you guys saw a brief snippet of what I saw for hours. So I'll kind of expand on kind of what was being yelled and said to me to elaborate on why I'm here on behalf of condemning violence. In this room where I was held hostage and essentially held for ransom, actually not essentially, I was held for ransom, the protesters from outside the room were yelling at the officers who were on the outside of the door protecting me, "You're only protecting her because she's a white girl." And of course, these officers then were terrified. They were terrified to do their job because who wants to be accused of that accusation? They were yelling things such as, "You shouldn't have came here. You knew this was going to happen. You were asking for this. Open that door and let us at her and we'll handle her. She doesn't get to go home safely. She doesn't deserve to go home to her family."
You were there that day. What was the topic you were speaking on?
Let me reiterate what I was there speaking on. I was there speaking on behalf of protecting women's sports. My speech consisted of, I probably spoke for 45 minutes, to which I opened it up for question and answers afterwards, I actually only opened it to opposing questions because I wanted to have this conversation, not because I want controversy, but because I want to have that open dialogue. I think that's how we create solutions. Mm-hmm. My speech consisted of, I of course talk about what it means to be a female athlete, the amount of training, the dedication, the sacrifices that you have to give to compete at the level I was competing at. That national championships is the fastest meet in the entire world. I talked about what that experience looked like. I talked about the locker room. I talked about the silencing, the very real silencing that we dealt with because of our universities. And of course—
And Ms. Gaines, may I ask you, any of the people that threatened your life, your safety, kidnapped you and held you hostage in that room that day, were any of those right-wing extremists?
No. The people who were in the room for the speech portion, it was about 50% protesters versus 50% supporters. But of course, the aftermath of really the ambush, again, I can't tell you every single one of their political affiliation, but I can almost certainly say that there were no right-leaning protesters in that room.
Okay, I want to point out, because there's been a lot lost here, let's talk about the recent 4 mass shootings in the past 5 years. Colorado Springs shooter identified as non-binary, Denver shooter identified as trans, Aberdeen shooter identified as trans, Audrey Hale, the Nashville shooter, identified as trans, but trans people only make up about 0.5% of the population. Just recently, there was a Trans Day of Vengeance, which is definitely not right-wing extremism or violence. This looks terrifying, and it's definitely from the left, because on the right, I can assure you we believe in 2 genders. It's male and female, and we support Title IX women's sports. You, Riley Gaines, and any other female athlete that wants biological men to stay out of their sports dressing rooms and women's privacy areas. This is what left-wing extremism and violence stems from is the movement that wants to use trans terrorism against Americans, violating the whole idea of biological science, that there's two genders, and that children should not be coerced and brainwashed into this sick ideology. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back, and I now recognize Dr. Tanadar of Michigan for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the Trump administration's Homeland Threat Assessment that says that among domestic violent extremists, white supremacist extremists will remain the most persistent.
I yield for I recognize Ms. Green for 5 minutes of questioning, second round.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just while we've been sitting in this committee room having this hearing today about left-wing extremism and violence, literally, as we were being gavelled in, we experienced some left-wing extremism of our own on the second floor of this building while we've been in here. The Center for Popular Democracy invaded our office building this afternoon to push their extreme agenda on everything from climate to the debt ceiling. Approximately a dozen were arrested while we were sitting in this hearing room. Thankfully, my staff brought over pictures to share with you all. This happened right here in the rotunda of the Cannon building while we were sitting here in this hearing, having this hearing on left-wing extremism. I mean, you kind of can't even make this up. But George Soros funded it. It's the Open Society that funds this group. Here they are being arrested by Capitol Police. We really appreciate their work. Here they are being loaded into the vans, thankfully. And here's some of their signs that they left here in the Cannon building. I don't know if we call that an insurrection, left-wing extremism, violence. I'm not sure what we call it. But I would like to remind, I'd like to remind everyone that while we're talking about white supremacy, Ms. Spitalneck, you were talking about white supremacy.
It's Spitalneck.
Oh, I apologize, Spitalneck. Ms. Spitalneck, while you were talking about white supremacists and abortion, I totally agree with you. There's a lot of white supremacists in the abortion movement and abortionists because they have murdered over 20 million black babies in America since Roe versus Wade in 1973. That's on average 900 black babies are aborted. They're ripped apart inside their mother's wombs. So I would agree with you. That could be labeled white supremacy, or we could just label it murder. And it should never be happening. So if you want to talk about white supremacy and the abortion movement, you should really analyze that in your human rights groups that you run as you collect donations from people with your nonprofit. Because I think that is something extremely important to talk about, is the right for those black babies to have lives as American citizens, the right for them to be born, the right for them to be given a chance to live as free Americans instead of murder. You think this is funny, Ms. Spitalneck? Is this funny to you? Is babies being murdered in the womb funny to you? Because you're smirking and laughing at me right now.
What's not funny are the black people and Hispanic people and Jewish people and Muslim people who have been murdered in synagogue, in church, in supermarkets, in mosque by white supremacists.
Are you aware that all colored people are murdered? That is a fact, that every single color person has been murdered. That's not unusual. It's not just that people of color are murdered. White people are murdered too. Murder is not just for minorities. That may be a shock to you because you seem to dive deeply into all kinds of misinformation and seem to be uninformed yourself. But if you're going to talk about white supremacy and abortion, You need to study very hard about who the targets are, and it's not just black women, and it's not just black babies, it's Hispanics as well. And I think that's important for you to understand. And if you apparently care about human rights and you care about studying extremism, let's have a little talk about extremism, shall we? I think that's important because that's what this hearing is all about. I'd like to inform you, or maybe you don't know, maybe you do know, I doubt it. You mostly care about white supremacists and white-wing extremism. But there's quite a pattern of left-wing violent protests on college campuses today. Ms. Gaines here was a victim of it. Do you support what they did to Ms. Gaines? These trans terrorists chasing her into a room, do you support their movement?
I am absolutely sorry that Ms. Gaines felt threatened and unsafe while she was on a college campus, and that's not acceptable. But again, the statistics tell us that when it comes to politically motivated violence, in 2022, every single murder was committed by a right-wing extremist.
Every single murder in America was committed by a right-wing extremist?
Every single politically motivated murder was committed by a right-wing extremist.
Are you sure about that?
I am
Are you aware that the Tennessee shooter just recently identified as a man and she was a biological woman? Was she a right-wing extremist as well?
Gentle lady's time has expired. I'll allow the witness to answer the question.
So that was a shooting that happened in 2023. There is no evidence as to what ideology motivated that shooting. And what we do know is that cisgender males are responsible for the vast majority of mass shootings in this country.
I'm sorry, I don't know what a cisgender male is. There's only two genders. It's male and female. That would be that. So no one knows what a cisgender male is. It's a made up.
Unfortunately,
idea.
the anti-trans invasion
from Georgia
language that you've been using
yields back. I
does
recognize
nothing but
Mr. Strong
normalize
for
the
his
extremism
5
we're
minutes of
talking about
questioning.
here today.